It was 3 a.m. when Bramwell Rossi stood in his study, surrounded by rows of monitors that displayed every corner of his mansion. His finger hovered over the playback button, anxiety clenching at his chest. The security company had just finished installing the final camera that afternoon, transforming his sprawling estate into a fortress of digital eyes. Every room was now under constant watch. His daughter, Addie, always in sight, her every movement recorded. Bramwell had always considered himself a man of control, of strategy. The cameras weren't just a way to keep his daughter safe. They were a way to keep her protected from the world and, perhaps more importantly, from himself. The mansion was vast, opulent, filled with polished marble floors and chandeliers that dripped with wealth. Every surface gleamed with obsessive maintenance, every room a carefully curated display of power. It wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for. But lately, it felt more like a cage. The mansion had always been a place of solitude, but it had become a cage of his own making after Addie's condition changed everything. She was the one thing that had completely dismantled his world, his perfect, invulnerable world. He remembered the day she came home from the hospital 16 months ago, fragile and broken. The doctors had been careful with their words, but it was clear. Addie would never walk again. Her legs rested motionless under the soft blanket. Her eyes, so full of life, staring up at him, silently asking him how this was possible. The grief was suffocating. His empire was built on strength, control, and the appearance of invulnerability, but none of that mattered now. Addie was his weakness. And in a world where weakness could be exploited, he would do anything to shield her from the dangers lurking beyond the polished gates of his mansion. At first, he'd hired caregivers one after another, but none of them were right. They failed him, each for a different reason. Some were too rough, others too distracted. He watched it all through the cameras, scrutinizing every moment, making sure none of them ever let their guard down. The first caregiver was let go after Bramwell saw her impatience when she changed Addie, the way she hurried through her task with no regard for her comfort. Another was fired after talking on the phone during feeding time, leaving Addie's attention divided when it should have been focused solely on her. One by one, they were all dismissed, until only one remained, Cassidy. Cassidy had come to him through unconventional channels, her application unremarkable, her history filled with gaps she hadn't explained. She'd stood in his foyer with a quiet confidence that he couldn't place, wearing simple clothes that spoke of experience rather than youth. It was when she asked to meet Addie before accepting the job that Bramwell had felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected. Respect, maybe. Most caregivers had been eager to start the job without asking questions, but Cassidy had insisted that meeting Addie first was a necessity. When he led her upstairs to Addie's nursery, Bramwell had been prepared to watch her assess the child as a task to be managed. But what he witnessed instead was something that shook him to the core. Cassidy had dropped to Addie's level, meeting her eyes without hesitation, speaking to her as if she was a person, not a problem. She introduced herself gently, asking permission before she touched Addie's hand, waiting for a sign of acceptance. And when Addie responded, her fingers curling around Cassidy's, Bramwell felt something twist in his chest. It was a look, a connection. It was the first time in months that Addie's eyes had shown something more than stillness, and Bramwell had felt it like a punch to the gut. Something was different about this woman, something beyond her ability to care for his daughter. Cassidy seemed to understand his daughter in ways no one else had. The decision was made in that moment. As the days went on, Cassidy's competence quickly became apparent, and yet there was something else, something beyond her professionalism. She was attentive in a way that felt more like a calling than a job. She'd sing softly to Addie while she bathed her, a lullaby that had him pausing in the doorway, listening to the sound of her voice. It reminded him of the warmth of his own mother, an echo of a time before the coldness of his empire had crept in. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to feel the tenderness of that kind of care. Cassidy didn't just care for Addie, she nurtured her in a way that was transforming. Bramwell watched the footage of her every day, unable to pull himself away from the screen. He saw how Addie's responses improved under Cassidy's watchful eye. She began vocalizing more, reaching for toys with greater determination, her body moving with an ease that hadn't been possible before. It was as though she was waking up, not just physically but emotionally. But as much as he respected Cassidy, there was something about her that didn't sit right. She had a history she wasn't sharing, a past that remained hidden beneath her quiet exterior. Bramwell wasn't a fool. He'd seen enough to know that people didn't just walk into his world without a reason. And so he did what he always did when there was something to uncover. He watched, he waited. Then, one evening, he saw something that would change everything. The cameras had been set up to catch every angle of the mansion, and yet it was a small moment, unnoticed by most, that would reveal what he hadn't anticipated. Cassidy was alone in the hallway, standing near a table where a photograph had been left. A photograph of a young man. His eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, instinctively pressing play. There was something about this photograph, a man in his 20s, standing next to a medical facility. Bramwell felt a flicker of recognition, his heart pounding as he stared at the image. Who was he, and why did it seem so familiar? As Cassidy quickly gathered the photograph, tucking it into her bag, Bramwell's suspicion grew. This wasn't just a caregiver. She was connected to something. Something bigger than herself. And he was about to find out exactly what it was. Bramwell's mind raced as he sat back in his chair, watching the last moment of Cassidy quickly tucking the photograph into her bag. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk, his pulse quickening. There was no mistaking it now. Cassidy was hiding something. He had seen enough to know that the photograph wasn't just a snapshot. It was something much more. The young man in the photo was someone important to her. Someone who seemed to be connected to a world Bramwell knew all too well. The question was, who was he? Cassidy had been working in his home for nearly 3 weeks now, her presence seemingly beyond reproach. She'd been patient with Addie, gentle and kind, treating her like a real person instead of a project. That was something he hadn't expected, especially not after his string of failed caregivers. He had believed in her competence, and even felt a certain relief at how well she had handled the situation. But that photograph, it meant something, and he wasn't about to ignore it. The next day, Bramwell dove into his network. He knew how to get answers, quickly and quietly. He ran the name and address scribbled on the back of the photograph. Through the extensive database his organization maintained, a database that kept track of everything from business operations to the more dangerous aspects of his dealings. The search didn't take long. The address led to a rehabilitation facility in the eastern district of the city, a place that catered to those recovering from traumatic injuries. His stomach dropped as he read through the file. The young man in the photograph was Marcus Webb, Cassidy's brother, and Marcus had been in that facility for the past 14 months, recovering from injuries that had been sustained during a violent territorial dispute between rival factions in the area. A dispute that, as far as Bramwell was concerned, had been a part of his own operations. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He hadn't known about Marcus before, but he now understood. Cassidy wasn't just a woman looking for a job. She had come here for a reason. And it wasn't to care for Addie, not entirely. She had come to get closer to him, to find answers, maybe even to seek some kind of revenge or justice for what had happened to her brother. She had her own agenda, and Bramwell couldn't ignore it anymore. The depth of his discomfort grew as he pieced together the connections. Marcus Webb had been caught in crossfire, just another victim in the ongoing territorial battles between factions that included those connected to Bramwell's world. He knew it wasn't directly his fault, but it might as well have been. And now, Cassidy had been inserted into his life, close to his daughter, possibly as part of some calculated move to settle scores. He had to confront her. But he didn't. Not right away. Not when he still wasn't entirely sure what game she was playing. Instead, he watched. He watched through the monitors, as he had done for months now. And as each day passed, his suspicion of Cassidy's true intentions deepened. She was good at her job. Too good. Addie's progress was undeniable, but something nagged at Bramwell. He couldn't shake the feeling that Cassidy was playing a long game, and he was just a pawn in it. Then, another piece fell into place. He noticed that Cassidy had been leaving small personal items around the house, things she hadn't had before. A sweater draped over a chair, a book left on the kitchen counter. Her things were gradually appearing in spaces that were supposed to be strictly professional. His first instinct was to confront her about it, but there was a small part of him that hesitated. He wanted to know how deep this went, how much of her was tied to her past, and how much of it was tied to him. But then, one day, while Cassidy was in the kitchen, Bramwell made a decision. He would act. He'd walk through the house, his footsteps loud in the silence. As he approached the kitchen, Cassidy turned, and their eyes met. There was something guarded in her expression, as though she knew this moment was inevitable. She didn't try to hide the bag slung over her shoulder, nor the tension that had begun to seep into the air between them. He asked her to meet him in his study. As soon as they were alone, Bramwell didn't waste time. "Who is Marcus Webb?" he asked, his voice more forceful than he intended. Cassidy stiffened, but only for a moment. She didn't flinch. Instead, she answered with a calmness that chilled him. "He's my brother," she said, and there was nothing more to it. Nothing in her tone gave him any clue that she expected him to know who Marcus was, or how he had ended up in that rehabilitation facility. Bramwell's mind raced. "And why didn't you mention him?" Cassidy looked at him, her eyes steady, unwavering. "Because it wasn't important." "Wasn't important?" Bramwell echoed, stepping closer, his chest tight with growing frustration. "You've been in my home for weeks now, taking care of my daughter, and you never thought to mention that your brother was shot in a dispute tied to my operations?" Cassidy exhaled slowly, as though the words had been building in her chest for a long time. "I didn't need to. What happened to him, what happened to our family, isn't about you. It's about the choices people make and the consequences that follow." "And you've come here to make me see that?" Bramwell asked, his voice rising. "Is that it? You've been watching me, waiting for the right moment to get back at me?" "I've been taking care of your daughter," Cassidy said quietly. "And I've been trying to understand how you can build an empire on violence and not see what it does to people. People like me. People like Marcus." The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken truths. Bramwell wasn't sure how to respond. Everything he'd built had been on the belief that his actions were justified, that the cost was necessary to maintain control. But here, standing in front of him, Cassidy was challenging everything. She wasn't just some caregiver, she wasn't just a pawn. No, Cassidy was something far more dangerous. She was the mirror he didn't want to face, the one that reflected the cost of everything he had become. "Then what do you want?" Bramwell asked, his voice softer now. "What do you want from me?" She didn't hesitate. "I want you to stop hiding. I want you to see the damage your world has done, not just to me, but to everyone it touches. And I want you to make it right. For Marcus. For my family. For Addie." Bramwell paused. Her words stung, but they also rang with a clarity he hadn't expected. Maybe he hadn't been the one making the most important decisions all along. Maybe the real choice had always been hers to make. Bramwell sat back in his chair, the weight of Cassidy's words pressing down on him. His mind reeled. Make it right. What did that even mean? How could he possibly make up for all the damage his world had caused? He had spent his life building an empire on a foundation of power, control, and the belief that the ends justified the means. But Cassidy was right. He hadn't seen the full cost until now, until she had come into his life and made him look at it all through a different lens. Cassidy's challenge was clear, but it left him grappling for an answer he didn't have. He had watched his empire grow by swallowing everything in its path. Now, it felt like it was closing in on him, suffocating him and his daughter, too. He'd hidden behind surveillance, behind cold transactions, behind everything that kept him distant from the consequences of his own actions. Cassidy, in her quiet, relentless way, was forcing him to confront it. For days he went through the motions. He dealt with business, played the part of the distant, controlling father, and watched through his monitors. But it all felt different now. The cameras that once gave him a false sense of security now felt like a reminder of everything he had failed to do, everything he had avoided. The monitors were no longer just keeping Addie safe. They were watching him too. One night, when the house was quiet and the hum of the cameras filled the air, Bramwell found himself standing in front of the nursery door. He hadn't expected to be there, hadn't meant to wander into the space where Cassidy had been working with Addie for the past few weeks, but somehow his feet had carried him there. He watched through the small glass window, seeing Cassidy sitting on the floor, Addie in her lap, as they played with blocks. Addie's laughter, a sound so rare and beautiful, echoed through the room. Cassidy was kneeling, encouraging Addie to reach for one of the blocks. Her face was soft, her voice gentle, filled with encouragement. As Addie reached out with a smile, Cassidy smiled back, her eyes alight with warmth. The connection between them was undeniable, and in that moment, Bramwell realized something he had refused to see. Cassidy was more than just a caregiver. She was a lifeline for Addie, a lifeline he couldn't let go of. It hit him then. He needed her. Not just for Addie, but for himself, too. But how could he ask her to stay? To keep caring for his daughter when she knew the truth about who he was, about the empire he had built? How could he ask someone to love a child, to give so much of herself, when the very foundation of his world had caused her family so much pain? He didn't know how to fix it. He didn't even know if it was possible, but he knew he couldn't let her go. Not after everything she had done for Addie. Not after seeing how much Addie had begun to blossom under her care. The next morning, Cassidy arrived at the mansion as usual. She was in her typical routine, her bag slung over her shoulder, her focus entirely on Addie. Bramwell watched her through the cameras for a moment before stepping out of his office and into the hallway. When she saw him, her expression hardened, as if preparing for a confrontation. But Bramwell didn't want to fight. He didn't want to be the man who hid behind his power anymore. He was tired of playing that role. "Cassidy," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "We need to talk." Her gaze flickered to him, but she didn't respond right away. She had likely been expecting this moment, the inevitable confrontation, but she didn't seem eager to face it. "I'm busy with Addie," she said, her voice guarded. "I know," he replied, taking a step closer, "but this can't wait." She sighed and set her bag down by the door, crossing her arms. "What is it, Bramwell? What do you want from me?" The question stung more than he expected, but it was fair. He had made so many demands of her already, without acknowledging the toll it had taken on her, without recognizing that she wasn't just a hired hand in his home. She was a person, she had feelings, and she had every right to demand more than he'd been willing to give. He took a deep breath and spoke carefully. "I've been watching you, watching how you care for Addie, and I don't know how to say this, but I need you. Not just as her caregiver. I need you to stay. I need you to keep helping her, and I want you to stay for yourself too if you can." Cassidy didn't say anything at first, her face unreadable. Bramwell felt the weight of the silence between them, but he refused to break it. He had to say this, even if it meant admitting things he'd been unwilling to face. "I know what you're here for," he continued, his voice strained. "I know what you wanted when you came to work here. You wanted answers. You wanted justice for Marcus. And I'm not going to pretend I can give that to you, but I can give you something else." She raised an eyebrow, and for the first time in a long while, Bramwell felt uncertain. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I've been thinking about what you said," he replied, "about how my world has affected your family. I'm not going to pretend it's all been some big misunderstanding. I know the damage I've caused. I know what this business has done to people like you, and I don't want to keep ignoring that. I don't want to keep hiding behind this empire of mine like it doesn't matter." Cassidy took a step forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she were trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. "What does this have to do with me?" "I'm asking for a chance," he said, his voice steady now, "a chance to make it right, a chance to prove that I can change, to prove that I'm more than the man I've been up until now. I don't expect you to forgive me for everything, but I want you to see that I'm trying. And I need your help to do that, for Addie." The room was still for a moment. Then, Cassidy's expression softened, though there was still a caution in her eyes. "You think you can fix everything with a few changes?" she asked quietly. You think that you can just undo all the damage your empire has caused? No, Bramwell said, his voice firm but vulnerable. But I can start. I can start by showing you that I'm willing to listen. That I'm willing to do more than just hide behind cameras. I'm willing to trust you, Cassidy. And I'm asking for your trust in return. Cassidy looked at him for a long time, her gaze piercing through him, searching for any sign of deceit. Bramwell stood his ground, silently praying she could see the truth in his eyes. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can trust you, but I'll give you this. If you're serious about changing, if you really want to make a difference in this family, then show me. Prove it. Bramwell nodded, a weight lifting from his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he had a chance. He could change. He could prove to her and to Addie that he was capable of being something more than just a man surrounded by power. I will, he said quietly. I will prove it. The days after that conversation with Cassidy felt like they had shifted something fundamental inside of him. It wasn't easy, it wasn't perfect, but Bramwell knew he couldn't keep hiding behind the walls of his empire anymore. The mansion, which had once felt like a fortress, now felt more like a cage he had built for himself. The walls were still there, but they weren't as solid as they once seemed. And with every step he took to change, every moment he spent with Addie or Cassidy, those walls seemed to shrink a little more. The first real step was simple but profound. He started spending time in the nursery. Instead of watching through monitors, he entered the room, awkward at first, unsure of what to do, but slowly finding his way. Cassidy guided him, showing him how to hold Addie during her physical therapy sessions, how to comfort her when she was upset, how to just be there with her. It was a humbling experience, but it was also the beginning of something he hadn't realized he was missing. Real connection. Addie, who had been so silent for months, seemed to light up whenever he was present. She had always been wary of new people, unsure of who to trust. But slowly, as he spent more time with her, her trust in him began to grow. She started reaching for him, her small hands grasping at his fingers, her eyes lighting up when he spoke to her or played with her. The change in her, the small victories that added up over time, filled him with an emotion he had never known he was capable of: fatherhood. And Cassidy? She became more than just a caregiver to him. She became a partner. Over time, their conversations shifted from the logistics of Addie's care to something deeper. They talked about their pasts, their fears, and their hopes for the future. Cassidy's walls began to lower, and she allowed herself to lean on him, not just as an employer, but as someone who was finally willing to see her, to hear her, and to share in the weight of everything they had both been carrying. But change, real change, takes time. And it wasn't just the moments spent in the nursery or the quiet conversations between them. There were hard moments too. The world Bramwell had built, the empire that had given him everything he had, wasn't easily untangled. People around him began to notice the shift in him, and not all of them were pleased. Some of his more hard-edged associates didn't understand why he was suddenly making concessions, questioning things that had always been non-negotiable. There were whispers, rumors, and a few of his old friends tried to pull him back into the world of control and ruthlessness that had defined him for so long. But Bramwell stood firm. He wasn't going back to the man he had been. For Addie, for Cassidy, and for himself, he refused to. And as he began to change, so did his empire. He started implementing reforms in his business, changes that were long overdue. The policies that had once been so callous, so focused on profit and survival at any cost, began to shift. He introduced new safeguards, policies that would protect innocent people from the collateral damage his world had always caused. The violence, the unchecked expansion, it was no longer something he was willing to ignore. Of course, not everyone was happy with the changes. Some of his closest lieutenants questioned his resolve. They didn't trust his newfound softness, and they resented the direction he was taking. But Bramwell didn't flinch. He had come too far to let them pull him back. He knew the price of his old world, the cost of the violence, the wreckage it had left behind. And he was determined to rebuild, not just his business, but his life. Through it all, Cassidy was there. She supported him, even when it felt like the world was pushing back. And slowly, over time, the bond between them deepened. What had started as an arrangement based on necessity had evolved into something neither of them had expected. Cassidy had come to care for Addie, yes, but as she spent more time with Bramwell, she found herself caring for him too. One evening, as Bramwell stood in the garden behind the mansion, he realized how much things had changed. The garden had once been a showpiece, perfectly manicured, a space that symbolized the control he had over every part of his world. But now, the garden felt like a real home. It was a place where he and Cassidy sat together, where they laughed and shared moments that weren't about business or surveillance, but about being together. Annie had started to pull herself up using the furniture. The milestones that doctors had said might never come were becoming a reality. She was growing stronger every day, her laughter filling the mansion with the sound of joy. Cassidy had created an environment where Addie could thrive. The changes in the mansion, the small touches she had added, brought warmth to what had once been a cold, sterile space. But it wasn't just the decor that had changed. It was the people within the walls. Cassidy had brought light into their lives, and Bramwell had come to see the world through her eyes, with empathy and understanding that had eluded him for so long. The moment that would define their future arrived unexpectedly. Bramwell had been walking with Cassidy and Addie in the garden, when Addie, who had been practicing standing on her own, took a small, tentative step. Cassidy's gasp caught Bramwell's attention, and they both watched in stunned silence as Addie took another step, then another, before she stumbled forward into Cassidy's arms. Tears welled in Cassidy's eyes as she held Addie close, and Bramwell, unable to contain his emotions, dropped to his knees beside them. "You did it, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Addie smiled up at him, her small hands reaching out for both of them, as though understanding that this moment wasn't just a milestone for her. It was a victory for all three of them. In that moment, Bramwell felt his heart swell with pride and love, emotions that had once felt foreign to him, but now felt like the very core of his existence. That night, as they settled into the warmth of their new reality, Cassidy turned to Bramwell, her eyes reflecting the same unspoken understanding that had grown between them. "You've changed, Bramwell," she said softly, "and I see it. I see the man you're becoming." He looked at her, his voice steady but filled with a tenderness he hadn't known he was capable of. "I didn't think it was possible. But I'm here. I'm trying." Cassidy smiled, her hand resting on his. "That's all I ever needed." As the stars twinkled overhead and the sound of Addie's laughter echoed in the distance, Bramwell realized that this was just the beginning. He wasn't the man he had been, and the world he had built was no longer the one he was trapped in. The journey had been long, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time, Bramwell felt a sense of peace. And as he looked at Cassidy, and then down at Addie, he knew they had finally found something real, something worth fighting for.